Today, we're going to decode the hidden psychology behind minds that seem to operate on a completely different frequency, processing the world with an intensity that, well, is often completely misunderstood.
So let's just start with a question that probably feels a little familiar. Why do some people seem to obsess over the smallest details that everyone else just breezes past? You give them a simple answer, and suddenly you're 5 layers deep in a philosophical debate you did not sign up for.
Well, what if I told you it's not a personality flaw at all? We're going to explore how psychology is starting to reframe these behaviors, not as problems, but as signatures of a brain that's processing information with incredible depth and intensity. Think of it like a completely different operating system.
Okay, let's jump right into our first section, thinking in high definition. We're going to deconstruct the mechanics of what makes these intensely analytical minds tick.
First up, you know that person who is constantly asking, why? You give them a fact, and they immediately need to understand the entire system behind that fact. It's so easy to see this as them just being difficult, right? But what's really going on in their head is something else entirely.
Yeah, psychologists actually have a name for this: epistemic curiosity overdrive. Their brain is literally wired to hunt for logical gaps and map the full picture. It isn't about challenging you, it's about this intense neurological need to understand the complete architecture of an idea.
Next, what about the person who seems to have like a dozen tabs open in their brain at all times? You're talking to them, but you can tell they're also in 3 other conversations with themselves. We label them as distracted, but the truth is often the exact opposite.
This is something called cognitive multiplexing. And get this, it's not an attention deficit, it's an attention surplus. Their working memory is juggling so many variables, all the implications, connections, contradictions, that a single linear conversation can honestly feel way too slow for them.
And then there's the perfectionist, the one who gets paralyzed and just can't seem to start anything. We look at that and we think, oh, they must be afraid of failure. But again, the cognitive process underneath tells a very different story.
It's cognitive perfectionism. Their brain isn't just seeing one project, it's running a full-blown simulation of all the possible outcomes, all the potential roadblocks, every single little inefficiency. So that feeling they get from starting something that isn't perfect, it's a genuine, neurologically driven discomfort.
Okay, so that's the thinking part. But what about the feeling part? Let's move to our next section, because this high-definition processing isn't just intellectual. No, it's deeply emotional too. Have you ever met someone who gets genuinely, deeply upset about abstract concepts, like an inefficient system at work or some injustice they just read about? And they're usually told they're just being too sensitive or dramatic.
But that intensity is the key. When they see a flawed pattern or an injustice, their brain can react with the same blaring alarm bells that most people's brains reserve for an immediate physical threat.
There's a term for this, overexcitability. And it's so important to get this. They don't choose to feel more. Their neural wiring is simply more sensitive. It basically turns the volume way up on both intellectual and emotional signals, making their internal world incredibly vivid and intense.
So what about that brilliant person who suddenly seems to lose all their motivation? They have all this talent, but they just stop. And from the outside, we see it as laziness or wasted potential. But what psychology is finding is something called achievement meaninglessness. Their brain requires a level of complexity that routine, predictable work just can't give them. So when a task gets too easy, their dopamine system, the reward system, basically just shuts down. They aren't lazy, they are profoundly neurologically bored.
So you've got this intense thinking and this intense feeling. How on earth does that play out in relationships? Well, that brings us to our next section, where we'll explore the social side of communicating in a different cognitive language.
You might see this show up in someone's social life. They get older, and their circle of friends just gets smaller and smaller. From the outside, it can really look like they're becoming antisocial or cold.
But what's actually happening is a process called relational pruning. They're not withdrawing from connection. They're searching for those rare relationships where they don't have to constantly downshift their brain. They're looking for people who speak the same cognitive language.
And finally, that leads to this really tough paradox. The highly capable person who seems to have it all, but describes feeling fundamentally deeply alone. And from the outside, it's easy to dismiss that as them just being ungrateful.
But this is known as the curse of cognitive distance. It's that profound sense of isolation that comes from being surrounded by people, but feeling like absolutely no one truly understands the way your mind works. It's a loneliness for a shared reality.
So where does all this leave us? What's the big takeaway here? Let's bring all these ideas together and look at this from a totally new angle.
The bottom line is this. All of these patterns that society often labels as difficult or lazy or too sensitive, they're not signs of a deficiency. They are simply the signatures of a brain that is processing reality with a fundamentally different intensity and speed.
So the key takeaway is this. These minds aren't broken. They're just operating on an alternative cognitive frequency. And maybe the challenge isn't for them to change, but for our social structures to become more accommodating of all the different ways a mind can work. Makes you wonder, right? What would our world look like if we actually designed it for every frequency?